Good afternoon and welcome to LVS Perspectives number 48, an audience with Floyd Steadman, OBE. Floyd, welcome to LVS. You've been with us all day today. And I've never been in the presence of an OBE before.
Oh gosh.
And I'm going to ask you some more questions about that later.
Please do.
But have you enjoyed your day so far?
I've loved my day so far, Christine, and I've got to say, one of the most rewarding aspects of the day has been the questions from your students, and the way that the feedback that I've had. I've been wandering around school afterwards. So brilliant, and it's done exactly what I want, because I'm challenging people to not be afraid to have those conversations.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
So, as usual, if parents like to send some questions in, we'll probably answer them all at the end of the presentation. But
Yeah.
I'm going to pass over to you now, and I can't wait to hear this again. I've heard Floyd at least twice, and I can't wait to hear again. Over to you, Floyd.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, parents. And what I hope you can now see is the first part of my slide, which I'm sure there's up on the screen. And I'm going to talk to you about, briefly about my journey. My journey from being a black boy that people gave up hope on to success on the rugby field, success in education, and more recently, other success. But I want to start by looking at the picture on the right of the slide. There's a huge man standing beside me. His name is Maro Itoje. He is one of the best rugby players on the planet, and I played a very small part in getting Maro to play rugby. Let me explain. My first headship was of a medium-sized prep school in North London, and Maro was a year 6 student in my first term there. And I noticed when I was wandering the school corridors and out on the playing field, Maro was always there with a group of other girls and boys. You'd have a basketball or a football or a cricket bat, and he was outstanding. Not just because physically he stood head and shoulders above everybody else, but he had very good core skills. One day I went over and I said, Maro, you've got to try rugby. You're built for rugby. And the look that he gave me, I could tell that I wasn't getting through. So that evening I rang his father and I said, Mr. Itoje, your son has to try rugby. He could be an exceptional rugby player. And I'm delighted to say that Mr. Itoje Sr. did listen to me, did take Maro to Saracens, and Maro has now become one of the best players on the planet. He plays for my club, Saracens, he plays for England, he plays for the British and Irish Lions, and is an exceptional, not just rugby player, but he's actually an exceptional human being. The top left, it says the Floyd Steadman story. I was deeply honoured in October 2021 when Sky Sports did a documentary on me as part of their Black History Month feature. So if you are interested, just Google my name, Sky Sports, and that pops up. The bottom right, that cap of Saracens cap, it's actually a Saracens Honours cap, and it's only been awarded to 14 people that have been inducted into the Saracens Hall of Fame. And I would have told you before the new year that that was one of my biggest honours. Huge honour. But as we go to the next slide, you will see January the 1st, and I see that my name was on the King's New Year's Honours list, which was a complete surprise. And the citation was for services to rugby union, to education and to charity. And I'm hugely honoured. So this slide just really talks a little bit about me and what I've done, but I really want to focus on the very bottom, where it basically says that I was a looked after child, and I didn't have the support of parents that most people obviously would have. And I'm going to come on to that a little later on. And this third slide really just briefly talks about what I've been doing since retirement 3 years ago. I've gone into all of these organisations and I've delivered over 100 presentations to schools, to companies, to professional sports clubs. In fact, I'm going back to Saracens next week to meet Maro and the playing squad, which could be interesting. And it's a huge honour to be able to go in and really help organisations kickstart conversations that they need to be having. I am a teacher, I'm a headmaster, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds just to play this little game with me. You have 30 seconds to match the number, don't worry if you don't know the person's name, the number with the job that they are doing, or perhaps they did, because sadly a couple of these people are no longer with us. So your 30 seconds starts now. Christine is joining in as well. What do you think, Christine? What people are thinking? You can have a quick stab. What do you think?
Wow, very interesting. Some of them are, I think are probably quite obvious.
Yep.
I must admit, I'm not very good with names and faces.
Right.
Although some of the people do seem quite familiar. So don't ask me any awkward questions.
No, I won't.
Thank you.
But they are. So back to the slide, please. And so here we go. So number 1, Claire Balding. Claire Balding, CBE. Now that I've been awarded the OB, I know the importance of those 3 little letters after the name. And Claire is a broadcaster, a journalist and an author. And she's also the president of the Rugby Football League. But she's also a member of the LGBTQ plus community. Number 2 is David Lammy, MP for the Labour Party since 2000. In Tottenham, and stating the obvious, he is a black man. Number 3 is a really interesting character, Dame Evelyn Glennie, one of the very best contemporary musicians. She's a percussionist, and she has a physical disability. She's deaf. One of the best musicians, and she's deaf. Number 4, Stephen Hawking, a theoretical physicist, an absolutely brilliant mind, all about quantum physics and explosions and black holes. And again, he had physical disabilities. He was a wheelchair user. Number 5, Doreen Lawrence, Baroness Lawrence of Clarendon, OBE, the mother of Stephen Lawrence, the young black man that was knifed to death nearly 30 years ago. Why? Because of the colour of his skin. And stating the obvious, obviously she's a black woman. And finally we have Alan Turing, who was very, very well known in the Second World War. He was part of the group that cracked the Enigma code. But what many people don't know is he was part of the LGBTQ plus community back then. And the reason why I show that slide is because you're going to hear me talk about my journey, my experiences as a black boy and as a black man. But we must never ever forget all of the protective characteristics from the 2010 Equality Act. So many people will have challenges and struggles because of their gender, because of their ethnicity, because of their religion, because of their sexual orientation. And actually, they shouldn't really have to face those challenges. So please remember that. You'll hear me talk about ethnicity, but remember all of the other protected characteristics. But let me talk about my story. My family roots are Jamaican, and my family are from a very, very small community called Blue Mountain Valley in the parish of St. Thomas. Now, Blue Mountain Valley was one of the poorest communities in the poorest parish, St. Thomas. And it's interesting because when people think of the Blue Mountain area, you might have that idyllic picture that you can see on the left. The mountains in the background, the waterfall, it's hot and tropical and very, very inviting. The reality for the people in those communities, like my grandparents, was the shack that you can see on the right-hand side. There is no question, my grandparents lived in a shack like that. There would have been no facilities, no power, no kitchen, no bathroom. And everyone would be in either 1 or 2 rooms in the house, and that was it. My grandfather was a labourer, and he worked a very, very small plot of land for a pittance. My grandmother was a maid, and she cleaned in some of the big houses in the area, again for virtually no money at all. And my parents grew up in that lifestyle. And in 1956, they left that to come to the UK. Why? They clearly wanted a better life for themselves. But we must never forget this. Like thousands from the Caribbean islands and the countries of South Asia, they were invited to come over and help rebuild the motherland, the United Kingdom, after the destruction of the Second World War. And they came over. They came over in their thousands, like my parents. And as I said, my parents came over in 1956, and they were confronted by aggression and racism. Why? Because of the colour of their skin. But in my family's situation, there was also another challenge. You see, my father was a misogynistic wife beater and also a child beater. And before my first birthday, there was a very, very acrimonious divorce. And while that was taking place, me and my sister, who was 18 months older than me, we were taken out of the family home and we were put into care, into a nursery home. And I have no recollection of that part of my life at all. And I had to speak to my sister to get some of the facts. And she reminded me that while we were in the nursery home, my mother wanted to come and visit us, as any mother would want to see their children. My father didn't want her to and tried to put her off. She ignored that and she came to see us. He found out, he went to where she was living, and he attacked her and beat her up so badly that she was taken to hospital. My father, the wife beater, went to prison for 2 months. And it's hard for me to say that even now, my father, the wife beater, went to prison. But there was more, because you see, in some ways that he won, because my mother understandably walked away from this very, very toxic relationship, and she left me and my sister as well. So when my father came out of prison, my sister and I went to live with him, and life was very, very hard. He was a very old-fashioned Jamaican, and he thought that he was giving out good old-fashioned Caribbean discipline. And if we did or said the slightest thing wrong, he would find the nearest implement to beat us. And when I say beat, it wasn't just one hit. It would be hit again and again and again. I still have physical scars on my body over 50 years later from some of the beatings that I took at the hands of my father. And I put up with this for quite a while. And I got to the end of year 5, and it was the start of the summer holidays. And I was beaten and put in my bedroom for allegedly doing or saying something wrong. I have no idea what it was, and I'm certain that I didn't, because I was petrified. I mean petrified of my father. But he beat me, he locked me in the bedroom, and something snapped inside me. And I opened the window, climbed down the drain pipe, ran across the backyard, jumped over the fence, and I ran away. And I stayed away from home for nearly 3 weeks. And this is where people say, well, Floyd, where did you stay? What did you eat? Well, let's start by sleeping. As I jumped over the back fence, I remember bumping into one of my neighbours and thinking, oh gosh, my cover's been blown. And the response was something along the lines of, Floyd, don't worry, I'm not going to tell anyone, and I'll leave my shed open. I took that to mean that if I wanted to, I could sneak back and sleep in the shed. And later on that evening, after dark, I did sneak back. The shed was open, and there were some blankets there for me as well. So I managed to actually have a relatively comfortable night's sleep, literally right next door to my father's house. But it wasn't always possible to sneak back into the shed. And I found the next best place to stay was in one of the local playgrounds. There was a slide, and at the top of the slide there was a hut structure. And I found that if I slept there, it was uncomfortable, it was cold, but it was safe, and I had 2 means of escaping if I had to get away quickly, because the police by now were looking for me. Then on to food, and how did I eat? Well, if many of you remember, back then most people had their milk delivered by the milkman early in the morning. And I managed to talk to a milkman to give me a job supporting him. And I was his runner. He would drive his milk float and tell me how many bottles and where to take them, and I would run to the houses. He paid me, in old money, 7 and 6. That equates to about 36, 37 pence in obviously the money that we now use. That was enough for me to buy myself some food. So I could buy food, I found places to sleep, and I stayed on the run, evading the police for nearly 3 weeks. But I knew that this couldn't continue. I realised that I had to go back home at some point, but I didn't want to go home because there was a beating waiting for me. I then remembered that one of my primary school teachers lived a couple of blocks away. And I went and I knocked on her door, and she let me in. She gave me some food. She then did the right thing. She contacted the police. She contacted the social services, and they came to take me back home. And there's an image that I just cannot get out of my mind of standing on my father's front door being flanked by a policeman and a social services worker. The policeman knocks on the door, my father opened the door, and the look of disgust that he gave me. And he said to the policeman, I don't want him, take him away. A 10-year-old boy, his father, his own father saying, take him away. I'm a parent. I have 3 grown-up sons. My sons are 30, 27 and 25. And whatever they do, as their parent, I'm always there for them. Because it's part of our responsibility as parents. And I can never forgive my father for those words. But sadly, that meant that I was on my own. That was the summer of 1969, and some of you may remember a song by Bryan Adams in the summer of 1969. That was a good, happy song. Certainly 1969 wasn't a good, happy time for me. So what was it like for a 10-year-old black boy roaming the streets of northwest London in the summer of 1969. Well, look at this next slide. Top left. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish. I vividly remember seeing that sign in some windows, because back then, if people had a large enough house and they wanted to get a little more cash, they would rent a room out. But it was very, very clear who was not allowed to come into that room. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Top right. Those two couples were the four main characters in a very, very famous sitcom of the 1970s called Love Thy Neighbour. The language used in that sitcom was appalling and openly racist, but it was language that was accepted of that time. And we mustn't forget that, because back then you only had three stations, BBC One, BBC Two and ITV. And this was on, I think, ITV. Hugely, hugely popular programme. And I would go to school the day after that programme was on, and like thousands of black and brown skinned children, we were dreading going into school the next morning, because we knew that we would have a torrent of racist abuse aimed at us. But actually, you can't blame the children. They'd seen it on television, and they were only repeating what they'd seen on television. Language that we now know and accept as being wrong and racist was openly used all of the time a generation or so ago. The bottom right, you've got four skinheads. Skinheads hated black and brown skinned people. And I spent a lot of my teenage years running away from skinheads. Luckily, they never caught me, and perhaps that's why I became a half-decent rugby player. That picture on the bottom left, the mixed heritage couple, really, really intrigues me. You see, because I met and fell in love with a white lady from a very, very small village in the west of Cornwall. And we were courting in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and there was a lot of abuse aimed at us. So that couple in the 60s or 70s would have had an awful lot to face just because they were young, but different colours, and they fell in love with each other. Let me take you back to my father's front door. And I was standing on my father's front door being flanked by a policeman and a social services worker. And my father saying those terrible words, "I don't want him, take him away." I was taken into care. I was in the services of the Brent Children's Association. And I first went to a very, very large children's home. That's the black and white photo. And I was there for about 4 months while the authorities were deciding what were they going to do with this young black boy aged 10. And when they'd made their mind up, I was put into a much, much smaller unit. That was the colour photo. But when I was in the first children's home, the black and white photo, me and other mainly black boys began to get some really, really awful messaging aimed in our direction. We were told things like we were useless, we were the dregs of society, we would do nothing with our lives, we'll end up in trouble, we'll end up in young offenders institution, we'll end up in prison. Who was saying these things? The white adults that were looking after us were basically telling us how to behave. And when some of the boys did make poor choices and did get into trouble, the response was, "Well, I told you so." But why were they saying that? They were saying that because people were making assumptions about these young black boys based on one thing and one thing alone, the colour of our skin. For me, I wanted more. I didn't accept that I was one of the dregs of society and I'd do nothing with my life. And I can remember when I was in the children's home, I didn't have my father, who sadly wasn't a positive male role model, and I looked to these four men. Being a young black boy, I wanted young, older black adults that I could look up to and aspire to. And Pele and Muhammad Ali, Dr. Martin Luther King really inspired me. But my all-time hero was Nelson Mandela. And when people say, why Nelson Mandela? Or as some people know him, Madiba. Madiba was my hero because we all know that he was incarcerated in prison for over 27 years. Why was he in prison? He was in prison. He didn't want black people to be better than white people or dual heritage people. He wanted equality and equity for all, and he was prepared to give up a lot of his life fighting for this. And when he came out of prison in 1990, he should have been a bitter and twisted man, and yet he wasn't. And he really worked hard to unite the nation, and in 1994 became the first black leader for the Republic of South Africa. An absolutely astonishing man. When I was in year 6 in my primary school, back then, every student had to sit an 11 plus exam. If you did well in your 11 plus exam, you went on to a grammar school. If you didn't do so well, you went to what was then called a secondary modern school. Now, I sat my 11 plus, and my primary school teachers told me that I did very, very well. And I went to what was perceived to be a brand new comprehensive school, Kingsby High School, but actually it was the amalgamation of 2 schools, Kingsby County Grammar School and Tyler's Croft Secondary Modern School. This huge school had over 2,000 students on its split campus. There were nearly 350 students in each year group, ranging from A, the brightest, to L, the weakest. And I'm embarrassed to say that a generation ago, we were calling some of those weaker students the ESN students. ESN stands for educationally subnormal. Terms that students were referred to. Another term that these students were referred to was the R, or the remedial students. And interestingly, there was perhaps more black and brown skinned children in those weaker sets than there should have been. And perhaps they were there because English wasn't their first language, or they were just later developers. But they were referred to as educationally subnormal, which is absolutely appalling. Now, for me, and for my part, most of my friends from primary school were in the top 2 or 3, A, B, C. And yet I found myself in E, which was the bottom of the academic O-level streams. And because I was in the bottom of the O-level streams, it wasn't certain whether I would be allowed to do the O-level academic exams or the less academic CSE exams. And I pleaded with my teachers saying, I need to do my O-levels, I need to do my A-levels because I'm going to university and I'm going to be a teacher. And I'd have some teachers say things like, Floyd, you're good at sport, stick to the sport, don't go down the academic route. Or, Floyd, your father's a car mechanic, do something with your hands like your father. Why were they saying this? Again, and I've said it before, people were making assumptions about me based on one thing and one thing alone, the colour of my skin. But I kept pushing back, hopefully politely, and I won over enough of my teachers that I did do O-levels, which meant I could then move on to A-levels and then go on to university. But when I was at Kingsby High School, that's when I was introduced to rugby. And a bit like Maro, because Maro started playing proper rugby when he went to his high school. And I remember the excitement of playing sport. And back then, the options were the girls were doing netball and hockey, and the boys thought they could choose between rugby and football. Most were going to choose football because football was the national sport. But the world's PE teacher had other ideas. He lined us all up, and there would have been about 150 of us. And he then chose whether we would do rugby or football. He looked at me and he pointed to rugby, and I was so disappointed. I pleaded with him, but he wouldn't budge. I was doing rugby, and I was so angry. But actually, very, very quickly, that anger changed completely because I found my feet and developed as a rugby player very, very quickly. That quick snap decision by the Welsh PE teacher changed me, opened so many doors and gave me so many opportunities. I'm eternally grateful for that decision. But there were challenges. When I was playing as a schoolboy, you'd hear things like, well, the black boys are fast, so stick them on the wing, give them the ball and they can just run around everyone. Or, the black boys don't like physical contact, so when you tackle them, just rough them up a little. The problem with that is, remember, I had a father that was beating me. And so a tackle in rugby was nothing compared to some of the beatings that I'd received. And in fact, I enjoyed the physical contact of rugby. The one that was incredibly insulting was, the black boys aren't as intelligent, so don't put them in the key decision-making positions. And where was I playing? Scrum half, number 9, which is one of the key decision-making positions. On the left, you'll see a picture of me playing for my club, Saracens, and on the right is for me playing for a wonderful team called the Barbarians. Now, I managed to play for my club, Saracens, for 10 seasons, and I was captain for 4 seasons. I was the first black captain of a major rugby team in England. I was the first black scrum half in a major rugby team in England. and with that came its own challenges. And let me start by going from school to one of the top sports colleges in the country at that time. It was called Borough Road College. And that was such a tough college to get into, because everyone, junior international, senior international, you had to be at least county standard to even be considered. And luckily I did get in based on my rugby and my cricket and squash and one or two other sports that I was performing at that time. When you're in an environment like that, it was unusual for a fresher, a first year student, to break into the top team. But after 5 or 6 weeks, I found myself forcing my way into the number one team. There is a tradition in team sports that still happens today. The first time you play for your university, your club, even your country, some of my friends that played for England, they had to do this. In the evening, they're given something to drink, hopefully it's not too bad, and then you have to sing a song. Everyone could choose the song they sang, but not Floyd. I'm going to use awful language, but you have to know the song that I was forced to sing. I was told, Floyd's going to sing the song Sambo Was a Lazy Coon, which is such an awful, racist song. Now, clearly I did not want to sing that song, but I was also under pressure, because I knew that if I didn't sing that song, I'd have been called difficult and awkward, and you've got a chip on your shoulder, Floyd. It's only a bit of fun. It's only a little bit of banter. So very reluctantly, I did sing that song. And on one or two occasions afterwards, when called on, I sang that song. But once I'd established myself as the number one scrum half in that team, I refused to sing that song. If called on to sing, yes, of course I'll sing, like everybody else, but I'm going to choose the song that I sing. I remember that when I first was made captain of Saracens, I was a very young man. I was only 23 years old when I was first made captain, and there was so much interest in the national media, TV, radio, newspapers, and I spoke to a friend of mine who was one of the reporters for the Daily Telegraph, and I said, why is there so much interest? He said, Floyd, you're the first black captain. You're the first black scrum half. There's bound to be a lot of media interest because many people think that you're not up to the job. Well, I like to prove people wrong. And I think the fact that I played 469 times for Saracens over a 10-year period, I hope that I managed to prove the doubters wrong. But still there were challenges, because I was playing elite level rugby at a time before it was a professional sport. Even if you were an international player, you had to have what we called our proper job, our day job. And for me, I was a young PE teacher. I would spend all day teaching children's sport, and then 3 or 4 times a week off to the rugby club in the evening for another 2 to 3 hours of serious training. But there were problems. I was stopped by the police on so many occasions returning home from the rugby training. And it would normally go something like this. 1 or 2 police officers would approach me and very aggressively start to ask me questions. Where are you going? Where have you been? What's in the bag? I'd let them ask the questions, and I'd respond in a very calm, articulate way. And I'd tell them that I'd been at Saracens and I'm an elite rugby player. And I'd tell them that I'm a young PE teacher. And their attitude towards me changed completely. So here's the question. We know the answer, but I'm still going to ask the question. Why were they so aggressive towards me in the first place? Because they were making assumptions about me based on one thing and one thing alone, and that's the colour of my skin. I've been incredibly lucky because once I finished playing rugby, I then began to really take off in terms of my teaching career and going through the ranks from a PE teacher to a head of department to a deputy head. And back in 1990, the great St Paul's School appointed me as head of sport in their prep department, Collick Court. But I was the very first black teacher ever appointed by this school that's over 500 years old, which is a huge, huge honour. And if I fast forward, you can see the logo of 4 schools there. They're the schools that I've been headmaster of. 2 are in Surrey, you may recognise some of them. One's in West London and one is in North London. One of those schools, and I'm not going to tell you which one, it was the second week of term, and it was in the evening, and like your head, I'm very much high profile. People will see me in the morning, throughout the day, and in the evening. And a group of parents came to see me in the evening, and I could see that they were concerned and agitated, and I said, what's the problem? Well, Mr. Steadman, we've just overheard a conversation where some of the other parents are disappointed that we now have a black headmaster, but we want you to know that you've got our full support. And I was grateful for them letting me know, but it's just such an awful blow to hear that you've got parents in your school community that don't want you based on the colour of your skin, but they don't know how effective you are at your job. I think my response was, well, that's disappointing, but I'm still going to support all of the stakeholders in my school community, even those that have no confidence in me. Because my job is always to make sure that I'm supporting everyone. You see, what's interesting is that over the years, a great deal has happened to me. Some of it, yes, can be termed racist. Some of it, yes, can be microaggressions. But I believe a lot of it can be termed unconscious bias. And I'll come on to that, but just before I do, a lot of my friends have said, Floyd, how have you managed to remain calm and composed with what you've had to put up with? And I've told them, if I get angry, I'm actually going to perform in the way that some people expect and want me to be. The angry black man with a chip on his shoulder. I've got to rise above that. If I'm calm, I can articulate my points very, very well. Even if I don't win people over, they will understand my point of view. I work very, very hard to earn people's respect, but I also expect them to work hard to earn my respect. It's got to be a two-way process. So, unconscious bias. Please read the slide, because I'm not going to read everything from the slide, but what I will say is that we all have unconscious bias. We mustn't be embarrassed by the unconscious bias. We all got it. And I've put some simple examples there. And the one that I really want to focus on is that last example, me walking home at night. And I just need to expand on that. I now live in West Cornwall in a lovely little village near Penzance. But when I used to live in West London, I'd be invited to many rugby and education functions, and I'd be travelling home late in the evening. And it was a 10-minute walk from my local station in Ealing to my house. And if I was walking towards a lady by herself, a woman by herself, I would give them a wide berth. I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything, nor did she, but I understand how unconscious bias works. And for some, not all, but for some people, a woman, it's dark, a black man's walking to water. She's going to be nervous and perhaps a little unsure, but she can't explain why. That's the unconscious bias. That's the unconscious mind in action. And I don't want anyone to be fearful of me, so I'll always give people a wide berth. Please note, when we talk about unconscious bias, there are so many forms. I briefly before touched on the protected characteristics from the 2010 Equality Act. And those forms of unconscious bias are in red. But there were so many others, and I've just highlighted a few of the other forms in black. But there are so many forms of unconscious bias. We all have them. We mustn't be embarrassed by them. I just want to touch on just one or two little bits of information. There's a group called the Runnymede Trust, and I really like the Runnymede Trust because they're a think tank that do a lot of research and projects and write reports based on the unprotected characteristics. And they did this one about 7 years ago where they looked at minority teachers in education. And that top bullet point is shocking. I know things have improved since then, but 7 years ago, only a third of minority teachers were paid the proper salary. 2/3 of minority teachers were not paid the correct salary, which is appalling. Yes, we're in a better place now, but so we should be. The next thing that I wanted to have a quick look at is they did another piece of work on race and racism in English secondary schools. And for this time, they worked with a group called, actually they worked with 6 of the Russell Group universities. And what I should have said before the last slide is the Runnymede Trust very rarely do work by themselves. They understand their own biases. They normally work with other partners. And for this piece of work, they worked with 6 of the Russell Group universities. And that top finding is again appalling. Inequalities in education based on race and ethnicity exist at every stage of the educational journey, from early years through to university and beyond. A book that I finished reading last summer, and some of you may have read this book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. The author is Rennie Edo-Lodge. Really interesting book. I don't agree with everything that she said, but there was one point that really resonated with me. She was asked, when do you think we'll get to an end point? And her response, as you can see, and I've just added 2 small words. There's no end point in sight. You can't skip to the resolution without having the difficult, messy, and I believe 2-way conversation. It's not just about me venting and letting off steam. I'll be honest with you, but you have to be honest with me. It has to be a 2-way process. I think that's so important. I'm just going to move on because I'm aware of time, but I just want to touch on this one here. And this happened on September the 5th, 2022. A 24-year-old man, Chris Cubber, a 24-year-old black man, on the streets of South London, sat in a car, killed, some would say murdered by the police, by the Met Police. The question that many are asking, if it was a 24-year-old white man sat in that car, would the police have responded in the same way, or would it have been different? I'll let you decide. Next steps. And this is what I've spoken to all of the students about this morning, so please feel free to talk to your children about this. And I've said, we've all got biases. Don't be embarrassed by them. Try to find out, try to explore what are some of yours. There's a really good battery of tests that you can get from Harvard University. You just have to Google Harvard Implicit Tests. Each one takes about 7 minutes. The first time that I did one of these, I was a headmaster, and I did one on ethnicity, thinking smugly, I'm going to be fine, I'm very fair. What came across was that I was mildly against black and brown skinned people. That shocked me, but that really challenged me to look at my practice. And I believe that it was right, because when I was recruiting and interviewing a black or brown skinned teacher, I was almost certainly being a little harder on them to show my white colleagues that I was being fair, when actually I wasn't being fair. So it really challenged me to look again. All schools are really looking at this, and there are discussions within the school communities, teachers, pupils, parents. Schools are looking at training for the staff and for the children. Schools are looking to have a more inclusive, diverse curriculum that really celebrates diversity in its widest form, not just ethnicity. Think of the protected characteristics from the 2010 Equality Act. Because look at that bottom point. That's what schools are trying to do. Embed inclusive behaviours in all aspects of school life. And I've done this now nearly 100 times, and I've asked the same 4 questions every single time, because I think it's important that we don't dilute this. When is unconscious bias likely to influence your day-to-day actions or activities? Can you identify an unconscious bias that you've observed in yourself or perhaps in other people? What can you do to actively disrupt your own unconscious biases? Harvard test might be an option. And how can you use micro-affirmations, kind words, kind deeds, to counteract an identified unconscious bias that you have seen? 15 years ago, my wife, who at that time was the only person that knew my story, said, Floyd, yours is a fascinating, inspirational story. You need to write a book. And the book's going to be called A Week One Summer. Now, at the time, I said, there's no chance of me writing a book. I've got no idea where I'm going to start. Tragically, I lost my wife to cancer 6 years ago. There were just 12 brutal weeks from the diagnosis to her passing. And one of the things that I would do is write that book in the memory of my wife. And I'm proud to say that I have now done that. And I've donated 2 copies to your school library. And finally, the last 8 to 10 weeks have been an absolute blur since the announcement of my OBE. And you'll see there that on the left, I was interviewed by Sky Sports just after the announcement was live. And I told them a story how I nearly deleted the email that came through because I thought it was a scam email. And I'm so pleased that I didn't delete that email. And the picture on the right, which for me is quite embarrassing, because you'll see the captain of Scotland and the CFO of Scotland. I was invited into the Royal Box to watch the England v Scotland Six Nations rugby match. And at the end of the match, the Scotland captain is awarded the Calcutta Cup. But what you see is not the complete picture. You can see me on my phone. I was told off by my sons and many other people. But actually the story is that the captain was presented the cup by Princess Anne, who was about 5 away from me to my right. That's your left as you're looking. And I was taking pictures of them, him receiving the cup. I then looked at those pictures to say, yep, I've got some really good ones. And while I'm looking, I was totally unaware that he stopped in front of me for the press to take other pictures of him. And all I remember is my phone just went red hot with people buzzing, saying, Floyd, get off your phone, the TV's on you, which was very embarrassing. But it's just one of the many wonderful stories that I can say of the last sort of 10 weeks or so, because I've been invited to the House of Lords. I've met Dame Baroness Fluella Benjamin, who's invited me to lunch. I'm going to Mansion House for a banquet. I've never been to a banquet. So these wonderful things, opportunities. And if I can go back to where I started, that 10-year-old boy beaten by his father and left to fend for himself on the streets of northwest London to where I am now. It's been an incredible journey. I've been incredibly lucky, and I've now been given the platform to tell my story. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Floyd. There are a few moments there, quite emotional story, but thank you very much. And you've got your book here on there, so I'm going to hold it up so everyone can see. That's Floyd's book. And thank you very much for donating a couple of copies as well. I haven't read it yet, but I certainly will do.
Oh, you need your tissues.
I know, and I do. I'll make sure I've got plenty.
Yeah.
I've got some questions for you.
Please do. Fire away.
First of all, the OBE. Where were you when you were? Well, obviously you were in front of your computer when you got the email, but.
Actually, I wasn't in front of the computer, so I can tell parents now.
Yeah.
I got a very, very confidential email right at the end of November, and I was in London doing a presentation to a company. In Canary Wharf, and my phone buzzed. And at the end of the presentation, I had a quick look down to see who it was from, and all I saw was NY23OBE. Now we know that's New Year 2023 OBE, but taking it completely out of context, I thought that's a scam. I nearly pressed delete, but there was something in the back of my mind thinking, Floyd, don't press delete yet. So when I got back to my friends that evening, I read it once, twice, 7, 8, 9, as it was slowly sinking in. Oh my goodness, I'm going to be given an OBE. Huge surprise.
So what was the first thing you did when you got it? What was the first thing you did?
So when I got that information, the first thing I wanted to do was let my boys know and let my family know. I couldn't tell anyone.
Of course,
there's an embargo until Friday the 30th of December.
So you can't even tell your family?
Can't tell anyone. So I've got to sit there thinking, I've got to tell you a funny story. So I now live in West Cornwall, and my 3 grown-up sons, and I'm so proud of my sons, and they all came down for Christmas. And a couple of days before Christmas, we were chatting, all having a discussion, and the state school they went to in West London, the teacher there had been knighted, Sir Pritpal Singh. And somehow we got onto the school and Sir Pritpal, and I just flippantly said, oh, wouldn't it be great if I got a knighthood or something? My youngest son said, Dad, not enough people know, there's no chance. And I just thought, just hold on to that thought. When I told my boys, he was, oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. I felt terrible. But no, it was wonderful. But I had to keep quiet until the embargo was lifted at 10:30 on Friday the 30th of December. I had the text ready to go at 10:31 on Friday the 30th of December. And then for the next sort of week or so, my phone was just red hot.
I know, and I can remember when it was out on social media, because obviously we've met before as well, and I can imagine your phone must have just been going crazy.
Oh, it was going crazy, and I think the thing that I always try to be honest and authentic, and what I said to people is, it's a huge shock. Since I had the email back in November, I've sort of just been doing a little research, saying, well, how do you get one of these? Because I had no idea. Now what I do know is that someone nominated me. I don't know because they won't tell me. But the nomination happened about 18 months ago. There have been 1 or 2 small things that now make sense. Last summer, I was invited to a royal garden party down in Cornwall, and the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall, Prince Charles and Camilla, they were there. And I donated a signed copy of my book to the Duke and Duchess. But I was thinking, why am I invited to this? And then later in the year, the Lord Lieutenant of Cornwall invites me to lunch at his house, and I think, hang on a minute, something's not quite right. And I honestly felt I'm being checked for something. But even then, the coin didn't drop. So it now all makes sense.
But it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic. And with rugby, where do you see the future of rugby in schools?
That is such an important question that schools and head teachers need to be looking at now, because I would like to say that there is always a future for rugby. But the challenge is, as the games got more brutal and more physical And the physicality is not just what we see in the Six Nations, it's down to schoolboy level. You know, if you go and watch under 18s, the first 15 of any leading school playing now, they are very, very well developed young men. And now the women, the girls as well playing. And the physicality in the sport is concerning me because of the impact on the head. If I can just say that, and I don't want to take up too much time on this, the RFU, they botched their attempt, but the RFU are determined to try to take the tackle area lower. And I need to explain why, because maybe a lot of the parents don't quite understand this. In rugby, we've zoned the body into three zones. The red zone is anything above the shoulder, because we don't want head on head, because that could be catastrophic, and we don't want that. The green zone is basically torso down to waist. That's where we want the tackles and the contacts to be. Waist to knee is what we call the orange zone. It's fine to tackle there, but you might hit a bone, but it's not too serious. The really difficult part is the head zone. The way that rugby's being played now is that when people are running into each other, they're very much square on, the way that we are now, and we're exposing head on head. My belief is that we may have to go back to the way that I was taught rugby, and I used to teach rugby when I was a young teacher, and that is the first point of contact isn't the head, it's the shoulder. And if you do that, you're leaning your head to the side and semi-protecting the head. And I don't think there's enough thought given to that now. Did that make sense?
It does. I mean, I'm not a rugby player at all. I wish I could play. In fact, maybe never too old to learn a new skill, as I say. No. But a lot of schools are actually stopping playing it.
Yeah.
So why is there not more being done to tackle this head on, literally?
I think part of the issue and part of the challenge is that do schools have enough members of staff that are highly qualified enough in rugby to be able to teach and coach the game safely and effectively. When I started teaching in prep schools back in 1990, we would have 2 or 3 qualified PE specialists, and most of the other people in the department could have been 12, 15 people, were maths teachers and science teachers and art teachers that knew nothing about rugby. But I worked out quite quickly that I had a duty not just to protect the boys, because it was a boys' school that I was in, but also to protect my colleagues. So I paired a rugby qualified teacher stroke coach with a non-rugby qualified teacher. So I had the head of maths as my number 2. And as well as teaching the boys, I was teaching this other member of staff as well. So within a year or two, I could step back and know that he would comfortably understand all the delicate parts of rugby and also the danger, the flashpoints, the dangers. So schools have a responsibility to say, right, do we have enough people trained up? And if not, we might need to train them up more. I don't want to see rugby move away from schools, but the easy answer for some heads at the moment is there's too much danger. Let's take the danger out by just banning the sport.
Yeah. Thank you for that one. Now, going back to your childhood, how do you get over that? Do you ever get over it?
Gosh, Christine. I don't think you ever get over it, but you learn to adapt and live with it. You see, what I said to all of your students this morning is that perhaps mine is quite an extreme story, but in life we will all have challenges. Every single person will have challenges. It's how we respond to those challenges. That's what we're going to be defined by, the responses we have to those challenges. I, in some ways, have been incredibly lucky because, don't ask me why or how, but I've always had resilience and inner belief. When people didn't believe in me when I was a schoolboy, I believed in myself. Now, not every child's going to have that resilience and that inner belief. So what can we at schools do? I think I've shifted away slightly, I do apologise, but what can we at schools do to give the students the inner resilience? And I believe part of what we can do, and it starts with us, and I always used to say when I was the headmaster of my 4 schools, failure is an option because failure is part of the learning process. If you're not failing, you're in a comfort zone. You don't know how far you can really push and challenge yourself. Make those mistakes, and then you learn from those mistakes, you pick yourself up and you go again. Do you know if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And it is having that inner belief, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, knowing that you can do something. It doesn't matter how many times people tell you can't.
Yeah.
You can as well.
And I had so many times, you know, oh, you can't play in that position in rugby. You can't do this. I used to turn around and very quietly say, yes, I can, and I'm going to prove I can.
Yeah.
And I was just fiercely determined.
You had some really good questions from our children today.
Oh, wow, yes.
What was the top question you were asked today?
I had so many good questions. Possibly, well, I'm going to go for two.
Yeah.
The one, and your students didn't let me down. Every single time I've done this, someone asked the question, "What happened to your sister?"
Right.
And I spoke to 4 groups today, and every time, again, someone asked what happened to your sister, which actually shows that there was a care inside. They actually wanted to know, and they were on this journey with me. Well, actually, they also asked about what happened to my mum, what happened to my dad. But out of the 3, it was always, well, what happened to your sister?
Yeah.
You know, and sadly, in her case, it wasn't good. She was kicked out of the family home a year after me. She dropped out of school early. She didn't do any exams. She hung around with the wrong crowd. She got into drugs and other terrible things. She had 5 children from 3 different relationships. She had awful, awful bouts of depression, and it's only now she's coming through that. So, you know, me being removed from the family home, in some ways, opened opportunities. But sadly, in my sister's case, it worked the other way.
Yeah.
And that was one of the questions. The other one, which I thought was a really good question, I think was asked by 2 other groups, and that was, if you had one message for your younger self, what would it be? And I thought, what a great question. And the way that I answered that was that be true to yourself, believe in yourself, keep driving forward, but the regret that I had when I was a younger person was there were times when I saw things and I heard things, not just aimed at me, but aimed at other people, and I kept my head down and didn't say anything. And I'm now saying, if we hear and see things, we mustn't be afraid to call them out straight away.
Absolutely.
And I regret when I was a younger man. You could argue society wasn't ready to listen to me. That's not the point. I should have put my head above the parapet.
Absolutely. And if we all did that, the world would be a better place.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I know I'm hogging your time, and there's some
Don't
questions
worry.
coming through.
Don't
So
worry.
I've got one. Those nights that you spent when you were sleeping as a child, 3 weeks away from home, you're on your own. What are you thinking at night?
Put bluntly, you are in survival mode. You know, it's just about, you know, it's surviving the night, to get up early. And I didn't have a watch, so I forced myself to get up because milk rounds were early, as you know.
Yeah.
And I've got no idea how I managed to force myself to get up and get to the place, to be there, to do the milk round. I think you are just on survival mode and you do whatever it takes to survive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We've got some questions here,
Oh.
so we're going to go, right, okay.
Okay.
So Colette says, your statistics show that racism and inequalities exist throughout all levels of education, although from an independent school perspective, due to the selective nature of schools, there are fewer people of colour in independent schools. Do you think, in your opinion, enough is done to tackle racism?
That's a great question, and I would say to you that in the past my answer would have been enough hasn't been done, but I now know that enough is being done, and let me explain. And that is, and your head will know this firsthand, all schools now have a responsibility, not just on racism, and we mustn't forget that's part of the whole EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion piece, and all schools have a responsibility to make sure that they are keeping up to pace with not just policies and practices, but making sure that schools are inclusive, safe spaces for the children. So I would argue that all schools have to, because actually part of the inspection regime, you know, Christine, that's going to be one of the things they're going to be looking at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And with such a diverse culture as well, we have children from all over the world.
Yes, you do, yeah.
And it's a good community.
It's a great community,
Yeah.
but even in great communities, more needs to be done.
Oh, absolutely. It's Colette here as well. You mentioned you supported Marco through his journey to professional level. Do you have any tips for aspiring rugby players of the future?
Yeah, I do actually. And my tips would be, you've got to be very, very dedicated. You've got to be very, very focused. You must work very, very hard on what I would term the basics in rugby. You know, whatever your position, and different positions have different basics. You work hard on the basics. You work hard on your nutrition and your diet and your training. But actually, one thing that I think marks a professional sports man or woman, not just rugby, from others, isn't actually how hard they work. It's that drive, that desire, that passion. You can work very, very hard but not have that passion. My youngest son is an outstanding rugby player. He is good enough to be a professional, but he doesn't want it. And he doesn't have that drive.
You've got to want it.
And I'm not going to force him.
No. I think we've got another comment somewhere down there. Have we? Or are we there? Are they all the questions? That's brilliant. So thank you so much.
You are very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure to come in.
And it's wonderful to have this chat. It's almost as if there's no one else out there, and it's quite lovely actually. And a couple of things you said I'm going to pick up after the camera.
Yeah.
I've got a connection with Barrow Road as well. I'm going to pick that up with you, not on camera though.
Okay.
And also, being brought up in the 70s, I remember the 3 channels. I remember having to click them. I remember Love Thy Neighbour.
Well, actually, I said Love Thy Neighbour, but I could have gone with, there were 2 others.
Yeah.
Do you remember On the Buses?
Oh, yes.
Do you remember Till Death Us Do Part?
Yes.
What was Rising Damp?
Yes.
Yeah, and all of those. But that's important because, and we mustn't sort of brush it under the carpet. Look, we have to accept that as society's evolved, language has evolved, and language that was acceptable then, we now know is totally unacceptable. And let me give you another example. And this is quite an interesting example. So I have 3 young men, 3 dual heritage. Notice I say dual heritage young men, delightful young men. When I was a boy, they would have been called half-caste, which is such a derogatory term that we cannot use anymore. Half-caste went to mixed race. Mixed race went to mixed heritage. Mixed heritage went to dual. And then you'll have people say, Floyd, how do we refer to your sons? My response is, talk to them.
Yeah.
And each of them would say something different. One might say, oh, use mixed race. One might say, oh no, I'm dual heritage. So it's about talking to people on that personal level, those 2-way conversations to get to know the person behind what you initially see. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And that the poster that you showed as well when you were
looking for no blacks, no dogs, no Irish.
My in-laws came over from Ireland in the 50s.
Do they remember that?
Well, they've never mentioned it, but I must admit,
speak to them about it.
Because it just shows you, isn't it? How people are treated. And I think when I was at school, I remember in primary school, my best friend was from Jamaica, and we never even thought about it through primary school. But as children grow older, you've got these influences and everything else, and then you become more conscious of your unconscious bias. Correct,
and it's the influences, the societal influences, as well as the family influences that impact on our unconscious bias. You know this, and I guarantee your audience will know this. We meet someone, and within 5 seconds, we formed opinions, but that's the unconscious mind.
Yeah.
And we think, we think about someone, but we can't explain why we've got this opinion. Yeah. It's the unconscious mind.
But that Harvard online test, I've done it myself.
How did you get on?
Yeah, no, it was totally
Can
unexpected.
You say online? On air?
I can.
Good.
I can.
Good.
I'm going to be brave. Right,
Good.
okay.
Well, go for it.
Totally unexpected. I have a leaning towards American people, the American culture, and I can't see why.
Can you see why?
No.
That's interesting.
No.
But what I would say is that I would urge people to do it just to challenge yourself.
Yeah.
Think, actually, perhaps there's some truth. It might not be. You might think, no, there's nothing in it. But for me, it really shocked me and it challenged me. And I honestly can say, I think when I was recruiting and I was interviewing black and brown skinned people, I was probably being a bit too hard to show my colleagues I was being fair. But I'm not being fair at all.
Yeah.
So
and it's recognising it, isn't it?
It is recognising it.
And challenging it as well.
Definitely.
It's Floyd Steadman, OBE. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You are and thank you for inviting me to your wonderful school.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.